I gifted my daughter this beach house as a 12th wedding anniversary present. That day I drove over to visit, but stopped short when I saw a stranger standing in front of the door, holding a clipboard, casually taking pictures of the entire house. Looking inside, I caught my son-in-law hiding behind the thin living room curtains, standing perfectly still and staring right at me instead of coming out to greet me. A cold chill ran down my spine. I knew that something was wrong. Thank you for being here. It truly means the world to me. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. Let's see how far this story has traveled. And a quick note, some elements in this story are fictional, added for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or places is coincidental, but the lesson inside is one worth keeping. Some mornings, I make the drive out to Harlow Beach before the sun has fully risen, and I sit on this porch like it belongs to me, because in every way that actually matters, it does. The drive is 25 minutes from my place. Door to door, if the light on Carpenter Road cooperates. I've made it so many times by now that my truck knows the turns before I do. Saturday mornings mostly, sometimes Sunday, occasionally a Wednesday, when something I can't quite name pulls me out here midweek, and I find myself watching the Atlantic go gray and then gold from a chair I built with my own 2 hands. I should tell you a few things about myself before I go any further. My name is Warren. I'm 68 years old. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer, the kind of man who looks at a building and sees the bones of it, the load-bearing walls, the places where pressure collects over time. I retired 4 years ago, but that way of seeing things never really leaves you. You spend 4 decades reading blueprints. You start reading everything else the same way. People included. I live alone. Have for 8 years now, since June passed. My house is a modest place on the edge of Calverton, the town just inland from here, with a yellow front door that June picked out one Saturday afternoon because she said it made the whole street look like it was in a better mood. I never changed it. I don't plan to. This house, though, the one I'm sitting in front of right now, this one is different. It's a single story, built low and wide the way beach houses should be, so the wind doesn't get ideas. Heart pine floors throughout, the kind that darken to amber over time and hold the warmth of the sun long after it sets. Wide doorways. No steps up from the front walk, which I designed on purpose because my daughter Nora had a bad fall off her bicycle back in 2018, left knee. 2 surgeries, and I wasn't going to build her a house that fought her every time she came home. The windows face the water. All of them. I spent 2 weeks arguing with myself about the structural implications, and then did it anyway because some things matter more than load calculations. I finished it 14 months ago, March of last year. I built it for Nora. I finished it in the year she and Brett marked 12 years of marriage, though the house was never about Brett and never about the marriage. It was about Nora and about Gracie, who is 8 years old and has her grandmother's laugh, loud and sudden and completely unself-conscious, the kind of laugh that makes strangers in restaurants turn around and smile. I did not build it for myself. That distinction matters. It's the whole point of this story in a way. I reach through the front door. I leave it unlocked on the mornings I come early, and I pick up the small framed photograph from the side table just inside. June, maybe 10 years before she got sick, standing on a beach that isn't this one. Her hair is doing what it always did in salt air, which is whatever it wanted. She's laughing at something off camera. She looks like herself. I put this photo here when the house was finished, not at my place in Calverton. Here. People who know me have asked about that. My buddy Sal from the old firm, my neighbor Ted. They ask why I didn't keep it at home, and I've never had a clean answer for them. The best I can say is this. My house in Calverton is where I live. This house is where the promise is. And June was the one who made me make the promise. It felt right to put her here. This is where the story ends. This porch, this morning, this particular slant of April light on the water. But to understand why I'm sitting here, why any of this matters, I have to take you back to the beginning, to a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, to a woman's hand in mine, to a promise I made before I fully understood what keeping it would cost. This house has a story. I'm going to tell you all of it. I didn't know then that the most dangerous thing about this house wasn't the money I put into it. It was what it meant to someone else. 8 years ago, I stood in a hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and I made a promise I didn't fully understand yet. That's the honest way to say it. I didn't understand it. I thought I did. I nodded. I said the words. I meant them the way a man means things when he's standing at the edge of losing everything. But the full weight of what I'd agreed to didn't settle on me until much later. Until I was alone in my kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning with a sleeping infant and a house that had gone completely, permanently quiet. But I'm getting ahead of myself. March 2017, Mercy General, 3rd floor. The hallway outside room 314. The fluorescent light above the nurse's station buzzed with a sound like a trapped insect. I remember that sound. I remember it the way you remember things that were happening while your life was changing, not because they mattered, but because they were there. June had been sick for 14 months by then. Breast cancer caught late, fought hard. She was 49 years old, and she fought it the way she did everything else, methodically, without self-pity, and with an occasional dark humor that unnerved her oncologist and made the nurses adore her. She made it longer than they told us she would. That was very June. I won't describe what she looked like at the end. That's not mine to put into words. What I will tell you is this. Her hands were still hers, even then. Long fingers. The knuckle of her left ring finger slightly enlarged from the arthritis that had started in her 40s. I held that hand for most of the last 2 days. I know every line of it. She spoke to me just before midnight on a Tuesday. Her voice was low, lower than it used to be, and she had to stop twice to find her breath. But her eyes were clear. That's the thing I want you to understand. Her eyes were completely clear. Take care of our girls. Warren, she said. Both of them. Nora still needs her father, even if she doesn't always know how to say it. And this little one. She paused, turned her head slightly toward the small bassinet the nurse had wheeled in so June could see her. Gracie, 4 days old, born into a family that was simultaneously expanding and breaking apart. This little one is going to need to know what real love looks like. Make sure she sees it. I told her I would. She died 6 hours later at 5:47 in the morning, while the sky outside was doing that thing it does in early spring, turning from black to a dark, uncertain blue, not quite committing to dawn. I drove home alone. Nora was at the hospital still. Her husband, Brett, had come to get her, and her friend was staying with her. I offered to stay, too, but Nora shook her head in the way she does when she needs to fall apart privately. She got that from June. I'd offered to keep Gracie for the night. Nora hadn't slept in 2 days, and the baby was calm. And sometimes the most useful thing a father can do is carry something heavy so his kid doesn't have to. So I had Gracie in the infant seat in the back of my truck, asleep before we hit the highway. Small fists curled up near her face like she was ready for a fight she didn't know was coming. My house in Calverton was dark when I got there. I hadn't left any lights on because I hadn't planned on coming home that night. I stood in the front doorway for a moment, Gracie's carrier in one hand, and I looked at what 8 years of living with someone looks like when that someone is suddenly gone. It looks like a pair of reading glasses on the end table. It looks like a cardigan draped over the back of the couch because she was always cold. It looks like 2 coffee mugs in the dish rack because she'd washed them both that last morning before the hospital called to say she'd taken a turn. Her slippers were by the door, the kind with the memory foam insoles that she'd ordered online and loved unreasonably. I stepped around them. I couldn't bring myself to move them. I sat down in the chair by the window with Gracie against my chest. 4 days old, breathing in that quick, shallow way newborns do, like they're still surprised by the whole concept of air. Outside, the street was empty. The yellow door of my house caught the last of the nightlight and glowed faintly, and I thought about June picking that color on a Saturday afternoon because she said it made the whole street look like it was in a better mood. Take care of our girls. I looked down at this tiny person on my chest, this child who had never met her grandmother, would never remember the sound of June's laugh or the way she smelled like cedar and hand lotion. I thought about Nora 30 miles away in a hospital room that still held the shape of her mother. I was 60 years old. I lived alone. I was a structural engineer who understood load-bearing walls and tensile strength and what happens to a building when the pressure is applied in the wrong place for too long. I had no idea how to do what June had asked me to do, but I had said I would. That night, sitting in the dark with Gracie asleep on my chest and June's slippers still by the door, I decided that not knowing how was not the same as not doing it. I would figure it out. Nora had her mother's eyes, and for a long time, and thought that was enough to keep everything together. I should tell you about Brett before I tell you about the house, because you can't understand one without understanding the other. Brett. Alan Calloway, 43 years old now. When Nora first brought him to my place in Calverton, this was the spring of 2012, about 4 months before the wedding. He was 31, and he had the kind of confidence that reads as competence until you've known a man long enough to tell the difference. He shook my hand at the door. Firm grip, eye contact, the whole package, complimented the house. Great bones on this place. Warren. Which, coming from a real estate agent, landed somewhere between professional observation and a line he'd used before. I showed him around anyway. He asked smart questions about the foundation, the age of the roof, the HVAC system. He knew his stuff. I'll give him that. At the time, Brett was doing well. Better than well. Actually, he'd built a solid book of business in residential sales up and down the coast, mid-range properties, mostly a few luxury listings. The kind of career that looks like a straight line going up when you're in your early 30s and the market is cooperating. He closed somewhere between 30 and 40 transactions a year. He drove a clean car and wore clothes that fit. He talked about the future the way people do when they genuinely believe it belongs to them. What happened later wasn't a mystery once you understood how the market shifted. Around 2015, 2016, the whole industry started changing underneath guys like Brett. Online platforms started doing what brokers used to do. Buyers stopped needing a middleman to find listings. The commissions shrank. The volume dried up. Some agents adapted, went high-end, went commercial, rebuilt their whole approach. Brett didn't. He kept doing what he'd always done, just with fewer clients and worse margins. And by 2019, the gap between his lifestyle and his income had become a problem he was solving with other people's money. But in 2012, none of that had happened yet. At the wedding, that August outdoor ceremony, a vineyard about an hour inland, the kind of venue that costs more than it looks, I stood near the back and watched Brett wait for Nora at the end of the aisle. He looked at her when she came through the gate in her dress, and I studied his face the way I study blueprints, looking for where the load settles. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's proud to own. I want to be careful here because I could be wrong. I've turned that image over in my mind enough times that I'm not entirely sure anymore what I saw and what I've since projected onto the memory. Maybe it was just a man who loved his bride and showed it in a way that read differently to the father watching from 20 feet away. That's possible. I don't want to be unfair. What I can tell you is that I noticed it, filed it away, said nothing because Nora was happy, and because a father's job at his daughter's wedding is to hold it together and mean it when he says the toast. The years that followed settled into a rhythm. Holidays at my place in Calverton, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the occasional birthday, June's cooking first. Then, after 2017, mine and Nora's combined efforts, which were competent but never the same. Brett was present at all of it, sociable enough. He could hold a conversation, remembered what you'd said time before, brought decent wine. He was the kind of person who's easy to be around without being easy to know. Gracie came along in late 2016, born about 4 months before June passed, which meant June got to hold her twice before the end. And I am grateful every day for those 2 times. Having a grandchild in the house changed the texture of those family gatherings. Gracie was the kind of kid who filled a room without trying the way her grandmother had. In 2019, Brett called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Not a Sunday dinner kind of call. A Tuesday. He needed $25,000. Short-term cash flow problem. He said. A deal had fallen through. Another one was pending. The timing was just off. He'd pay me back in 90 days. He was relaxed about it. The way he was relaxed about most things, like the outcome was already decided, and he was just filling me in. I knew better. 40 years of reading blueprints had taught me to check every line before I signed anything. A loan with no paperwork is just a gift with extra steps. I knew that. I'd told clients that. I'd watched people lose real money over handshake agreements that everyone remembered differently 6 months later. But Nora was happy. Or seemed to be. And there was something in the way Brett had asked. Easy. Unbothered. Family to family. That made pressing for documentation feel like an accusation I wasn't ready to make. So, I wired the money and said nothing about contracts. That was my mistake. I knew it when I was making it. I made it anyway. He never paid it back. Not in 90 days. Not in 90 weeks. We never discussed it again. And I never brought it up because by then other things had started to matter more. The day I finished the house. March 2024. Final walkthrough before I handed Nora the keys. Brett came with her. He moved through the rooms the way he'd moved through mine back in 2012, checking, assessing professional habit that never quite turns off. He knocked on the wall in the hallway, tested the window latches in the kitchen, stood at the big glass doors facing the water for a long moment. Then he turned around and looked at me. Nice place. Warren. Not thank you. Not this is incredible, or I can't believe you built this. Just nice place. The way you'd describe a restaurant you'd recommend to someone but wouldn't go back to yourself. The way you talk about property. I smiled and said I was glad he liked it. But I held on to those 2 words the way I hold on to things that don't quite fit quietly in the back of my mind, waiting to understand what they were telling me. There's a difference between a man who looks at a house and sees a home and one who looks at it and sees a number. I just didn't know which one Brett was yet. The idea for the house didn't arrive all at once. It grew the way most important decisions do. Slowly, then, all at once. It started sometime in 2021, about 4 years after June died. During a Tuesday afternoon when I was sitting at my drafting table going over load calculations for a commercial project I didn't particularly care about, I put down my pencil and thought about Nora, about the apartment she and Brett were renting, about the way Gracie had asked me at Christmas whether Santa knew which house they lived in because they'd moved twice that year. I thought about the fact that June had asked me to take care of our girls, and I had spent 4 years mostly just showing up at holidays and calling on Sundays and telling myself that was enough. It wasn't enough. I knew that. I opened a new file on my drafting software and started drawing. What followed was 3 years of quiet, deliberate accumulation. I skipped the fishing trip to Montana I'd been planning since 2019. I picked up 2 smaller consulting projects on the side, one for a church renovation in Calverton, one for a private developer who needed a second opinion on a foundation issue. I stopped going out for dinner on Fridays and started cooking instead. I refinanced the Calverton house at a lower rate and redirected the difference. None of it was dramatic. It was the same arithmetic I'd been doing my whole career, just pointed at something that mattered. By the spring of 2023, I had enough. The design had been evolving the whole time because that's how I work. I don't believe in rushing the drawing phase. Get the blueprints wrong, and everything that follows is just expensive corrections. So, I drew and revised and drew again. And every version was a little bit about engineering and a lot about Nora. Single story. Because she'd had a bad fall off her bicycle in 2018. Left knee, 2 surgeries. The second one better than the first. But neither one perfect. No steps up from the front walk. Wide doorways. 36 inches instead of the standard 32. Because someday, arthritis or a bad day might make those 4 inches matter. Heart pine floors throughout, because they're warm in winter and they hold up. Big windows facing the water, because Nora has always thought better when she can see the horizon. Every choice had a reason. That's the only way I know how to build. I found the lot at Harlow Beach through a retired contractor I'd worked with on and off over the years. Waterfront parcel, modest size, decent elevation above storm surge, important on the Carolina coast where the Atlantic has opinions. The lot had been sitting for a while, which kept the price reasonable. I broke ground in the fall of 2023. That's when I met Audrey. She came over about a week into the foundation work, walking across the adjoining property with 2 mugs of coffee and a look on her face, like she decided to come say hello and wasn't entirely sure it was a good idea. Her name was Audrey Dalton, 66 years old, recently retired with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in a room where people had to pay attention when she spoke. She'd been a circuit court judge for 22 years, family court, then civil, then a rotation through criminal before her knees made the commute untenable, and she retired to the beach house she and her late husband had bought years ago as a vacation property and never quite gotten around to selling. She lived alone. Had for 3 years since her husband Martin passed. She told me this matter-of-factly, the way people do when they've made peace with a fact and no longer need sympathy for it. "What are you building?" she asked, handing me one of the mugs without asking whether I wanted it. "A house," I said, "for my daughter." She looked at the lot at the foundation stakes, at the view of the water beyond. Then she nodded once and didn't ask anything else. We drank the coffee. She went back to her place. The next morning, she came back with 2 more mugs. That became the pattern. I didn't ask her to keep coming. She didn't ask permission. Some things establish themselves without a formal agreement. Over those months, I learned that Audrey had spent a significant part of her judicial career in civil court handling property disputes, fraud cases, forged deeds, contested estates. The kind of cases where someone had trusted the wrong person with something that couldn't be taken back. She'd seen enough of that particular damage to develop a finely calibrated instinct for it. I didn't know then how relevant that would turn out to be. My parents called in November, about a month into the framing. My father, Eugene, is 91 years old and lives at Pine View, a care facility about 40 minutes from Calverton that he describes as not as bad as I expected, which is the most you can ask for at my age. My mother. Miriam is 88 and thinks the staff waters down the soup. They called together, which they do on speakerphone with the volume turned up high enough that I can hear both of them even when only one is talking. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" my father said. "It's already built. Dad, I'm in the framing stage. I mean, financially. I've run the numbers." A pause. "Your mother wants to know if Nora knows." "She knows I'm building something. She thinks it might be a workshop. She doesn't know the details." Another pause. Longer. "That sounds like you," my mother said from somewhere near the phone. She wasn't wrong. The house was finished in March 2024. Nora and Brett's 12th wedding anniversary was in August. I had been aware of that date for 2 years while I was building, not because I planned the house as a gift in that conventional sense, but because it gave me a frame, a reason to finish by summer that was separate from the engineering schedule and easier to explain than the real one. I finished early, which was not a surprise. I have always preferred to be ready before I am needed. Before I handed Nora the keys, I sat down with a property attorney in Harlow Beach and transferred the deed. The title was put in Nora's name clearly and cleanly, with my name retained as a secondary interest during my lifetime. I had seen too many families professionally and personally watch property slip away because the paperwork wasn't right. A deed doesn't protect against everything, but it was the obvious first step, and I took it. I thought about setting up a revocable living trust. At the same time, a trust adds another layer, makes it harder for anyone to encumber or transfer the property without proper authorization. But the attorney said the deed structure was solid, and I didn't have any specific reason for concern. I filed it away as something to revisit. I had no particular urgency. That was a gap I would come to understand later. The day of the walkthrough. Nora stood at the front door for a long moment before she went inside. I had not announced it as an anniversary gift. I had not announced it as anything in particular. I had simply said, "Come see what I've been building." She put her hand on the doorframe, the one I'd built out of reclaimed white oak, sanded down to a finish that was smooth without being slick, and she stood there with her hand on the wood like she was checking whether it was real. Gracie went straight in, 7 years old. No ceremony, just motion. She ran through every room and came back to report that the bedroom with the window seat was hers, and she wasn't negotiating. I stood in the yard. I always do that with a finished structure. Step back and look at it from the outside. Let the whole thing be itself for a minute without me in it. 40 years of habit. I thought about June, about the way she described the beach house she'd always wanted, and the offhand way she talked about things she didn't expect to actually happen. Nothing fancy, just enough windows to feel like you're outside when you're in. This house had 7 windows on the ocean side. I'd counted them more than once during construction and thought about that. I think she would have liked the view. I told myself standing in the yard while my daughter walked through the rooms and my granddaughter claimed her window seat. I think she would have liked knowing Nora had somewhere safe. That night, I drove home to Calverton. The house was quiet, the same as it always was, but it felt different. Not empty or exactly, more like a chapter that had ended on the right word. For 6 months, the house was exactly what I built it to be. Then September came. Spring turned to summer the way it always did at Harlow Beach. Quietly, with salt in the air and the sound of Gracie's feet on the porch boards every Saturday morning when I pulled into the driveway. She had a habit of hearing my truck before it even turned onto the street. I never figured out how. By the time I cut the engine, she was already at the edge of the front walkway in whatever she had slept in. Sometimes a dinosaur shirt, sometimes a dress she had clearly put on herself because the buttons were wrong. And she would stand there with both arms raised like I had been gone for a year instead of 5 days. I was never a man who cried easily, but those mornings came close. We had a routine, the three of us. Nora would be inside starting breakfast by the time I came through the door, and the house would smell like coffee and the faint sweetness of whatever fruit she had cut up for Gracie. I would set my jacket on the hook by the door. The brass one I had installed myself at the right height for a child and an adult both. And we would eat at the kitchen table with the windows open and the ocean doing what the ocean does, sitting there indifferent to everything, which somehow made it easy to talk. Nora looked better that spring than she had in years. There was color in her face. She walked without favoring her left knee the way she used to because there were no stairs to negotiate, no uneven thresholds to catch her off guard. I noticed it the second week of April, watching her cross the kitchen in bare feet, and I felt something that I did not have a word for at the time. It was not pride exactly. It was more like relief at a calculation that had finally come out right. Brett was mostly absent in those months. On the occasions I asked, Nora said he was working. I did not press. A man has a right to his work, and I was not there to audit anyone's schedule. He appeared twice, maybe 3 times over the summer, late Friday evenings, tired-looking, gone again by Sunday afternoon. He was polite. He made coffee once and left the pot on for me without being asked. I thanked him and thought nothing more of it. One afternoon in June, Gracie and I were sitting on the back steps, watching the tide come in. She was drawing something in a small notebook she carried everywhere that summer, seashells mostly, and the occasional figure that was either a person or a very large crab depending on the angle. She stopped drawing, looked up at me, and said without any particular lead-up, "Grandpa, why don't you live here with us?" I looked at her for a moment. "Because this is your house, sweetheart," I said. "My house is the one with the yellow door." She considered this with the gravity that only an 8-year-old can bring to a simple fact. Then she nodded once and went back to her drawing. I do not think she fully understood the distinction I was making, and I was not entirely sure I could explain it any better if she had asked me to try. My house was 25 minutes north in Calverton, a 2-bedroom with a carport and a side yard. I kept tidy out of habit rather than preference. I had lived there since June died. It was not a lonely house exactly, but it was a quiet one. The kind of quiet that accumulates slowly over years until you stop noticing it and start mistaking it for peace. Coming to Harlow Beach on Saturdays was the opposite of that quiet. Audrey Dalton lived 3 houses down on the same stretch of road. A compact woman in her mid-60s with short gray hair and the precise, unhurried way of speaking that I had come to associate with people who have spent decades being listened to in rooms where it mattered. She had served as a circuit court judge for 22 years before retiring the previous spring, and she had moved to Harlow Beach the same year I broke ground on Nora's house. We had become acquainted during construction when she brought me a thermos of coffee and asked without being intrusive what I was building and for whom. By that summer, we had settled into a Saturday morning habit. She would appear on her porch around 8 o'clock with 2 mugs, and I would walk over and we would sit in the 2 old Adirondack chairs she kept facing the water and talk for an hour, sometimes less, occasionally more. She told me about cases she remembered, not the violent ones, but the financial ones, the quiet frauds, the documents that looked right until someone looked twice. I told her about structures I had built, a pedestrian bridge in Oregon that had outlasted its projected lifespan by 18 years, a school in rural Virginia where I had spent 6 weeks in the rain trying to get the drainage right. We were two people who had lived alone long enough to appreciate conversation that did not require anything of you afterward. On a Saturday toward the end of August, we were sitting in our usual chairs. The morning had gone flat and gray, the way it does before the weather shifts, and the ocean was the color of old pewter. Audrey had her mug in both hands, which she did when she was thinking about something she had not yet decided to say. After a while, she set the mug down on the arm of the chair and looked across toward Nora's house. "Warren," she said, "how well do you actually know your son-in-law?" I thought about Brett, the polite appearances, the early departures, the coffee he had left warming on the counter. "Well enough," I said. Audrey nodded once. She did not say anything else, but she did not look away from the house either. I did not think much about what Audrey said that afternoon. I had no reason to. Not yet. The first Saturday of September, I pulled into the driveway and saw a familiar car parked in front of the house and a full-size suitcase standing just inside the open front door. I sat in my truck for a moment before getting out. The car was Brett's, a silver sedan I had seen in various driveways and parking lots over 12 years recently acquired, still carrying the small circular sticker from the dealership on the rear window. The suitcase was dark navy upright, the kind with 4 spinner wheels and an extendable handle locked at full height. Not a weekend bag, not even a week bag. The kind of luggage a person packs when they are not certain how long they will be gone. The front door was standing open in the way doors stand open when someone has come through recently and left it that way out of habit, or because they expected to come back through it shortly, or because they had simply stopped thinking about it. The morning air was still warm. September at Harlow Beach holds its warmth longer than inland, and through the open door, I could hear the particular sounds of a kitchen in use, the coffee maker cycling, a cabinet being opened and closed, the low murmur of a radio on a station I did not recognize. I got out and went inside. Brett was at the kitchen table. He was wearing a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, his weekend presentation, the version of himself he wore when he was being comfortable on purpose. He had a coffee mug in front of him and his phone face down beside it, and he looked up when I came through the door with the easy, unhurried smile that I had known since 2012 and had never quite been able to assess accurately. "Warren," he said, "good timing. Coffee's fresh." Nora was at the counter slicing a melon, her back partially to me. She turned when she heard my voice and came over and kissed me on the cheek and said, "Sit down," in the automatic way she said it, the way she had been saying it every Saturday since the house was finished. The kitchen smelled like coffee and cut fruit and the particular salt-warm combination that came through the screen door from the beach side of the house. And everything about it looked the same as every other Saturday morning I had walked into since March, except for the suitcase in the entryway standing at full height with its handle extended going nowhere. I sat down. Nora put a plate in front of me. Brett refreshed his own coffee, and then, without being asked, poured a second mug and set it at my place before returning to his chair. It was a small thing, the kind of thing a person did when they knew where the mugs were kept and which cabinet held the filters and how many scoops the machine took. The kind of thing a person learned over time, or over the past day and a half. "I didn't know you were coming out this weekend," I said, which was not a question, but contained one. Brett leaned back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man making himself comfortable in a space he has decided is comfortable. "I needed to get out of the city for a bit," he said. "The market's been difficult. Things are recalibrating, which means everyone's waiting and nothing's moving. and you can only sit in a downtown office watching nothing move for so long before it starts to wear on you." He gestured vaguely with his coffee mug. "Nora suggested I come out and clear my head. Better to work from here than stare at the walls down there." Nora smiled from the counter. She looked comfortable. Not the brittle kind of comfortable that means something is being held together, but the genuine kind. The kind that comes from having the pieces of an ordinary morning in the right places. Brett in the kitchen. Coffee made. Her father at the table. I drank the coffee Brett had poured and thought nothing particular about it. There was no reason to think anything particular about it. Gracie came downstairs at 8:30 in the green sneakers she had worn continuously since June, the left one with its lace replaced by a piece of twine she had found on the beach, and which she had refused to exchange for an actual lace on the grounds that it worked fine. She sat beside me and ate the melon slices from my plate without asking which was standard, and told me at length about a project she had been given at school involving ocean ecosystems, which she had opinions about. Brett asked her one question, what her favorite ocean animal was, and Gracie said without hesitation that it was the mantis shrimp because it could punch things, and Brett laughed, and Gracie looked satisfied with this response, and the conversation moved on. It was a normal morning. I remember thinking that clearly in those specific words, "This is a normal morning," as though I needed to say it to myself to confirm it. After lunch, Nora took Gracie down to the water. Brett and I ended up on the front porch, not by arrangement, just by the way Saturday afternoons sometimes arrange themselves when the women in the house had gone somewhere, and two men were left with the space between them and nothing specific to fill it. Brett was looking at the house rather than at the water. He had done this before during the walkthrough in March, and once or twice since the particular quality of attention he brought to the structure, the lot, to the sight lines from the porch to the beach. I had filed it without labeling it. "Warren," he said, in the tone of a man making conversation, "what do you think this place goes for now? With the lot, the view, the build quality, all of it." I looked at him. "It's not for sale," I said. He raised one hand slightly, a gesture of concession. "Of course not. I'm not suggesting anything. It's a professional habit. You're in a space like this and you start running the numbers automatically." He glanced out at the water, then back at the house facade. "Properties on this stretch have been moving well, even with rates where they are. I'm just curious what the market would say." "Then you already know better than I do what it would say," I said. He smiled again, the easy one, and let the subject drop. We watched the water for a few minutes in the comfortable silence that had always been available to us when we weren't talking about anything that mattered. And then he went inside to take a call. I stayed on the porch. The afternoon light was coming in low across the dunes, and the beach grass was moving in the offshore wind, and the water was the green-blue it gets in early September before the color shifts. I stood there and looked at the house I had built from the outside, the porch boards I had selected, the trim I had painted myself over a weekend in February, and I thought about what it meant that a man had just asked me what it was worth and called it curiosity. When I went back in to say goodbye, Gracie followed me out to the truck. She walked beside me down the front path without saying anything, which was unusual. Gracie generally had something to say in transit. At the truck door, she stopped and looked up at me with the expression she wore when she was carrying something she had been holding for a while. She reached out and took hold of my jacket sleeve lightly. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "Dad's been on his phone a lot, like really late. After I'm supposed to be asleep, I can hear him talking." I looked at her for a moment. She was watching me with the clear, uncomplicated attention of a child who has reported a fact and is waiting to understand whether it is the kind of fact that matters. "Okay, sweetheart," I said. I put my hand on her head once. "Thank you for telling me." She nodded, let go of my sleeve, and went back up the front path. I drove home. The 25 minutes north on Route 17 had always felt like a reasonable distance, close enough for weekends, far enough for a life. That evening, sitting at my kitchen table in Calverton with the lights on and the house quiet around me, it felt like something else. Not far, but not close enough. Brett called it curiosity, but in my experience, men who ask about price rarely stop at asking. After that Saturday, I started coming by more often, not just on weekends. I told myself it was because I missed Gracie. That was part of it. The other part, I did not have a name for yet. The Wednesday morning was ordinary in the way September mornings at Harlow Beach tend to be cooler than August. The light flattered, the tourist traffic gone. I had no particular reason to drive out that day. I had a materials review. I could have finished at home, and my coffee was already made, and the 25 minutes each way was not nothing. But I locked up the house anyway, backed out of the carport, and pointed the truck south toward the coast. I turned onto Harlow Road at 8:53. I know the time because I checked the dashboard clock when I made the turn a habit from 40 years of job sites where everything that mattered eventually came down to when. The man was standing on the sidewalk in front of Nora's house. He was wearing a light blue polo shirt and carrying a clipboard under one arm. He had his phone raised and was photographing the house methodically, the way a professional photographs something when they are building a record rather than taking a picture for themselves. Front elevation, left side. He stepped back to capture the roofline. He moved without hurry, without looking around. The way a man moves when he is confident he has every right to be where he is. I pulled to the end of the driveway and stopped. I did not turn off the engine. In the state of North Carolina, taking photographs of a building from a public sidewalk is not illegal. It is not even unusual. Appraisers do it. Insurance adjusters do it. Surveyors do it. There was nothing I could have pointed to in that moment and called a violation. But I had spent 4 decades reading structures, reading sites, reading the small details that told you whether something was sound or whether it was about to go wrong. And something about the way that man moved told me he was not there for any routine purpose. I reached for my door handle. He was faster. He folded the clipboard under his arm, walked briskly back toward a gray sedan parked 2 houses down, and was inside and pulling away before I had the door fully open. Not running, not looking back. Just done the way a man is done when he has finished what he came to do. I watched the car until it disappeared around the bend at the far end of the road. By the time I could have followed, there was nothing left to follow. I sat for a moment with the door open and the engine still running. Then I pulled forward, parked properly, and went inside. Brett was in the living room when I came through the front door. I know this because I looked not obviously the way you look when you are checking on something, but the side glance a person learns after years of walking through buildings where you needed to know where everyone was before you spoke. He was standing near the window that faced the front yard. His phone was in his hand, screen up. He did not look out at me as I came up the walk. He may not have seen the man on the sidewalk. He may have seen him and thought nothing of it. He may have seen him and already, clears throat, known exactly who he was. I did not know which. I still do not know from that moment specifically. "Warren," he said when I came in. "Didn't know you were coming by." "I was in the area," I said. It was not true, but it was the kind of thing a person says when they do not want to explain the actual reason. And Brett accepted it the way people accept small untruths without looking too closely. Gracie came downstairs in her green sneakers and threw herself at me with the standard level of force for a child who has been awake for 2 hours and has been waiting for something to happen. I caught her, and we sat at the kitchen table, and Brett made coffee which I drank, and we talked about Gracie's second week of 3rd grade and whether the new teacher was strict or just quiet, which Gracie had not yet determined. It was a normal visit. I made sure it felt like one. I sat there and drank that coffee and said nothing because I had nothing in hand, just a man with a camera, a clipboard, and a feeling I couldn't shake. Before I left, Gracie pressed a folded piece of paper into my jacket pocket. I opened it later at my truck. It was a crayon drawing, 3 figures standing at the water's edge, one tall, one medium, one small. Above the water in the upper left corner, she had drawn a round yellow shape with rays coming off it that I first took for the sun before I looked more closely, and saw the words she had printed underneath in unsteady letters. June. I stood by my truck for a moment and looked at it. Then I got in, buckled up, and looked back at the window where Brett had been standing. It was empty now. I drove back to Calverton. That night, back at my own house, I wrote down everything I remembered about that man, the light blue polo, the clipboard, the way he moved through the shots without pausing front side, roofline, like he had a checklist, the gray sedan, the time, approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, Wednesday, mid-September. Then I called Audrey. That night, back at my own house, I sat at my desk and thought about what I actually knew about Brett and what I did not. The desk was the same one I had used for 30 years, a solid oak surface with a shallow center drawer and 2 deeper ones on the right side. The kind of desk that accumulates the record of a working life without trying to project binders, inspection logs, correspondence going back to the 90s. I kept it orderly out of habit. In 40 years of structural engineering, the difference between a detail you had written down and a detail you thought you remembered could be the difference between a building that stood and one that did not. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and wrote the date at the top. The first thing I wrote was not about the man with the clipboard. It was about the loan. $25,000 transferred to Brett's account. In March of 2019, I had the bank record in a folder in the bottom drawer because I keep bank records the way I keep everything organized, labeled, retrievable. I found it in under 2 minutes. The original transfer confirmation was there. Every quarterly statement since then was there. What was not there was any record of repayment, not a single deposit, not a partial payment, not a note, a text, or a conversation I could recall where Brett had acknowledged the debt since the first year. I had stopped expecting it somewhere around 2021 and had quietly reclassified it in my own accounting as a loss, the kind of thing you absorb for the sake of family and do not mention at holidays. I had told myself that was generosity. Looking at the empty column under received in the margin of my notes, I thought it might have been something closer to carelessness. I wrote $25,000, March 2019, no contract, no repayment, 5 years. Then I called Audrey. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she was still awake and had probably been expecting the call. That was the thing about Audrey. She did not say much that was unnecessary, but she was rarely surprised. I described the man, light blue polo, clipboard, photographing the house from the sidewalk, methodical, done and gone before I could get out of my truck. There was a brief silence on her end. I saw him, too, she said. Tuesday of last week, I was coming back from my walk and he was parked in front of the house. He had a clipboard then, as well, Tuesday of last week, the week before my Wednesday visit. He was there twice, I said. At least twice that I saw, Audrey said. I wrote down the plate number. She read it to me. I wrote it on the legal pad, pressed firmly enough that the numbers indented the sheet beneath. "A Virginia plate," she said. "Dark gray sedan." She thought a Honda or a similar make. I thanked her. She asked if I was going to look into it. I said I was thinking about it. "Warren," she said, and the way she said my name had the measured quality I had come to associate with her courtroom years, the tone of someone who had learned that the right question at the right moment was more useful than an answer. Shot to seal. When a man photographs a property on a public sidewalk, he's usually being paid to do it by someone who has an interest in the property. I already knew that, but hearing it said plainly by someone who had spent 2 decades listening to people explain why they had done things made it sit differently than it had in my own head. "I know," I said. "Good," she said. "Good night, Warren." After I hung up, I sat for a while without writing anything. Then I turned back to the legal pad and added a second section beneath the loan record. Mid-September. Man, light blue polo, clipboard, phone camera, front elevation, side, roofline, done quickly, left before contact, gray sedan, via plate, and I wrote the number Audrey had given me. Underneath that, I wrote a third item, something I had been turning over since the previous week, but had not yet committed to paper because writing a thing down made it more real than I was ready for it to be. I had been at Nora's house the previous Thursday, one of the unscheduled visits I had begun making since September. I had arrived mid-afternoon and let myself in through the side gate the way I always did. Brett had been on the back porch. He had not heard me come in, and I had not announced myself because I had been walking toward the kitchen and simply had not gotten around to it yet. His voice coming through the screen door was low and taut in a way I had not heard it before. Not angry. Controlled. 14 days. I know. This property is worth more than that. That was all I caught before I closed the kitchen door behind me and called out that I was there. Brett had come inside 30 seconds later, with his phone in his pocket and his expression arranged into something relaxed, and I had not said anything about what I had heard because I had not known what I had heard. I wrote it down now. The approximate date. The exact words as I remembered them. 14 days. I know. This property is worth more than that. I looked at the 3 items on the page. A loan that had never come back. A man with a clipboard and a camera standing in front of a house I had built. A voice on a back porch saying, "This property is worth more than that." Individually, each one had an explanation. Together, they had a shape I recognized from 40 years of reading plans. Structures that failed rarely failed from a single point. They failed because several small stresses, each one manageable on its own, had been allowed to converge in the same place at the same time. I closed the legal pad. I looked out the window of my home office at the dark and quiet street in Calverton, 25 minutes north of Harlow Beach, 25 minutes from the house I had built with my own money and signed over to my daughter. For the first time, I understood that 25 minutes was not nothing. 25 minutes was long enough for things to happen that I would not see. Audrey had given me the plate number. I wrote it down and put it away. I wasn't ready to open that door yet, but I knew the door was there. October arrived without warning, the way trouble usually does. One morning, the air was still warm enough to sit outside without a jacket, and by the next, it carried a cold that had not been there before coming in off the water with the particular finality of a season that has made up its mind. I had been coming to Harlow Beach more frequently than my old Saturday routine midweek visits, sometimes early morning arrivals before the house had fully started its day. I told myself this was practical. The deck boards on the south side needed resealing before the winter set in, and the caulking around the north-facing windows had begun to show its age. These were real tasks. I kept a list of them, but I was also watching. And by early October, I had stopped pretending otherwise, at least to myself. That morning, I turned onto Harlow Road at 10 minutes before 6 o'clock. I had not slept well. The LLC proposal. Brett had floated the week before, had been sitting in the back of my mind in the particular way that unresolved calculations sit, and by 4:30 I had stopped pretending I was going to sleep through it. I drove down early the way I sometimes did when something needed thinking through, and the water helped. The beach was still dark at the edges, the sun not yet over the horizon, the water the color of old pewter, moving in low, slow swells. I parked, went through the side gate, and walked around to the back of the house where the deck faced the water. Brett was already there. He was standing at the far end of the deck with his back to the house, looking out at the water with his phone in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. His shoulders set with the particular tension of someone who has been awake longer than the hour suggests. He did not hear me come through the gate, or if he did, he let a moment pass before turning, which told me something about how he was managing the morning. He turned when I was halfway across the deck. "Warren," he said, "you're early." "So are you," I said. We stood there for a moment in the way we sometimes stood, two people sharing a space without much to say, looking at the same water. I had stopped finding that comfortable around the first week of September. Now I found it informative. Brett spoke first. He said he had been thinking about the property, about the longer term, about what it meant to hold a beachfront asset of this value without the proper structural protections in place. He used the word structural in the way people use engineering language when they want to sound considered, borrowing the vocabulary of careful planning to dress up something that is underneath. A request. The most sensible thing, he said, would be a limited liability company. You put the property into the LLC, you insulate it from estate complications, you manage the tax exposure properly. He had turned slightly toward me now, not fully facing me, but angled in a way that closed the distance. It's a standard move for a property like this. I've set up a dozen of them. I looked at the water. Whose name would be on the LLC? I said. All of ours, he said. Nora's, yours, mine. I'd be the managing member, which just means I handle the administrative side. You and Nora would be full equity members. Nothing changes in terms of who the property belongs to. Of course, I said. He kept talking. He had numbers ready for mation costs, annual filing fees in the state of Virginia, a comparison of how the property would be treated under different tax classifications. The figures were specific and arrived without hesitation, which told me they had been assembled in advance, which told me this conversation had been planned. I let him finish. What Brett had described as administrative was in practice something more consequential. A managing member in a Virginia LLC has broad authority over the day-to-day management of LLC assets, including the authority to encumber those assets, to refinance them, to enter into agreements on the LLC's behalf, without requiring unanimous member consent on each individual transaction, provided, clears throat, the operating agreement was drafted to allow it. A managing member who drafted the operating agreement himself would have considerable latitude in how broadly that authority was written. The other members, Nora, me, would be equity holders on paper. The managing member would be the one with the pen. I had spent 40 years working with load-bearing structures. I knew what a transfer of weight looked like regardless of what it was called. I'll think about it, I said. He nodded. Then he said the thing I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. I'll need an answer fairly soon. Warren, these things take time to set up properly, and there are some timing considerations. He paused. A few weeks. Ideally. I looked at him. His expression was arranged into something patient and reasonable. His coffee cup was still in his hand, and he turned it slightly, a small restless motion that did not match the patience of his face. "I understand," I said. He nodded once more, satisfied with something, and went inside. I stayed on the deck until I heard the screen door close. The sun had come up fully while we were talking, the water shifting from pewter to a flat, cold blue. I stood there for a while longer than I needed to, looking at the water and thinking about a man who needed an answer in a few weeks, and had specific formation costs already memorized. Then, I walked to my truck and drove north to Calverton. I was at my desk by 9 o'clock. The legal pad was where I had left it, the plate number still faintly indented on the top sheet from when I had pressed too hard writing it down 2 weeks before. I had been carrying that number with me like an unread letter, aware of it, not yet ready for whatever it said. Brett's conversation on the beach had been enough. I called Audrey and asked, without going into the full explanation yet, whether she still had the contact she had mentioned when she gave me the number, someone who could confirm a registered owner through legitimate channels. She asked no questions. She said she would call me back. She called back in 35 minutes. The vehicle was registered to a Raymond Holt, address in Virginia Beach, licensed real estate broker, active status, Virginia Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation. I wrote the name on a clean page of the legal pad and looked at it. Then I spent the better part of an hour working through what was publicly accessible. Broker license records are public in Virginia. Name, license number, status, and in some cases the employing firm. Business entity, filings through the State Corporation Commission, list registered agents and principals, cross-referencing the two. I found what I was looking for without needing anything that was not already available to anyone who knew where to look. Raymond Holt had held his license since 2009. Between 2014 and 2017, he had been associated with Coastal Premier Properties, a mid-size residential and commercial brokerage operating out of the Norfolk area. Brett Calloway had also been associated with Coastal Premier Properties during the same period. The firm had dissolved in 2018. Both men had moved on in different directions on paper. They had not moved as far apart as the paper suggested. I sat back in my desk chair and looked at the name on the page. I had poured the footings for that house myself. I had sourced the heart pine flooring from a mill in North Carolina and watched it go down board by board over 3 weeks in the winter of 2023. I had designed every window to catch the light in a specific way at a specific hour, because Nora had mentioned once, years ago, that the thing she missed most about the apartment she had before the house was the morning light on the kitchen wall, and someone had sent a man to photograph it like a property listing. That name, Raymond Holt, had opened a door I had no intention of walking through. But once you have seen something, you cannot pretend you have not seen it. I didn't usually stay past dinner when I visited, but that Wednesday evening, Gracie asked me to fix the back porch light. The bulb had been flickering for a week, and she had decided with the complete conviction of an 8-year-old that the darkness it left behind was not ordinary darkness, but the specific kind that warranted concern. It was a standard fixture replacement. In practice, it took 40 minutes because the bulb size Gracie described did not match what I found in the socket, which meant a drive to the hardware store 2 miles down Route 17 and back. By the time the porch light was burning steadily, and Gracie had stood under it for a satisfied moment and then been walked upstairs and settled. It was 20 past 9. Nora had gone to bed at 9, citing a faculty meeting at 7 the next morning. Brett had said goodnight around 8:45, mentioning an early call. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink, dried them, and reached for my jacket on the hook by the door. That was when I saw the laptop. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, the section of counter between the coffee maker and the far wall, a surface that generally held the fruit bowl and Gracie's school papers. Brett had been using it as a secondary workspace since he moved in, setting up there in the evenings when Nora was grading papers in the living room. The screen was still lit, angled the way a person angles a screen when they step away briefly and intend to return. I understood later, when I had time to think it through carefully, exactly why it was there and why the screen was still active. In 6 months of visiting Nora's house, I had not once stayed past 9 o'clock. That was not an approximate pattern. It was a fixed one, the kind that a man who paid attention to routines would have registered and relied upon. Brett was a man who paid attention to routines. He had moved around this house for 7 weeks with the ease of someone who had mapped all the variables and found them predictable. He had not mapped for a burned-out porch bulb and an 8-year-old who was afraid of the dark. I did not touch the laptop. I positioned myself at a distance of approximately 4 feet and read what was on the screen. The email was from R. Holt. The subject line was fully visible in the preview pane. Refinance application. 14 Harlow Beach Road. $280,000. Below it, the body of the email was partially visible, 2 complete lines before the text continued below the screen edge. The first line referenced a power of attorney document. The second contained a specific date, November 1st. I took my phone from my jacket pocket and photographed the screen from where I stood. 1 image. I checked that it was legible, the subject line clear, the partial body text readable, the date unambiguous, and put my phone back in my pocket. Then I stood in the dark kitchen with my jacket half on and did not move for a moment. A refinance application. $280,000 drawn against a property worth $390,000 owned by my daughter. In a house I had built and signed over to her deed, and nothing more. A power of attorney, which meant someone needed to sign on behalf of a property holder. Nora's name was on the deed. Mine was not. A POA in Brett's favor, granted by Nora, would give him authority to act on the property's behalf in financial transactions, to refinance it, to encumber it, to extract from it whatever a lender would allow. But a POA requires the granting party to sign willingly and with full competence. A person who is confused, who forgets things, who seems to be losing the clarity that they once had. That person is a person whose family might reasonably step in to help, to manage things on their behalf, to take on responsibilities the older person can no longer reliably handle. I stood in the dark kitchen and thought about the Saturdays I had driven home feeling heavier than the drive warranted, the afternoons that had blurred, the evenings in Calverton when I had sat down in the kitchen chair and not moved for 2 hours. I had been attributing those things to being 68, which is a reasonable attribution because 68 carries its own legitimate weight. That was when I understood what the coffee was actually for. I had no evidence for that thought. Nothing beyond a pattern I had not yet fully assembled and a logic that had just locked into place like a load-bearing joint clicking home. I did not say it to myself as a conclusion. I registered it as the kind of possibility that once it has entered the mind does not leave quietly. I left without turning on any additional lights, and I drove home with the windows down despite the cold. The following morning, I was back at Nora's house before 8 o'clock with a set of lug wrenches I had genuinely left in the back corner of the grille. The previous evening, I remembered setting them down when I was looking for the fixture wrench and genuinely forgetting them in the shuffle. The reason for returning was true, which made delivering it easier. Nora was in the kitchen when I arrived, coffee made, Gracie already dressed for school. Brett was out at showing. Nora said he had left at 7:30. His jacket was hanging on the coat rack by the mudroom door. It was unzipped. A white envelope had slipped partially from the interior breast pocket, tilted at the angle that things tilt when they have been folded quickly and not quite secured. The envelope's address window faced outward. Through it, printed in the red block font that lending institutions reserve for correspondence they need you to take seriously, I could read 3 words clearly. Past due, $47,000. I retrieved my lug wrenches from the garage. I said goodbye to Nora and told Gracie to have a good day at school. I drove back to Calverton. At my desk, I sat down and looked at the photograph on my phone. Refinance application, 14 Harlow Beach Road, $280,000. Power of attorney, November 1st. I set the phone beside the legal pad and wrote the new figure below the others I had already recorded. $47,000 past due, seen on envelope breast pocket of jacket, Brett's morning of, and I wrote the date. Then I looked at what I had. A man who owed $47,000 and had a refinance application in process for $280,000 was not protecting an asset. He was liquidating one. The distance between those two things was the distance between a person solving a shared problem and a person solving only their own and leaving the house. The deed, and the woman whose name was on both of them to absorb whatever came after. 2 weeks, approximately, before his November 1st deadline. Numbers don't lie. And these numbers told a very clear story. I had the pieces. Now, I needed to understand how they fit together before Brett realized I was watching. Before I go any further, drop 11 in the comments so I know you're still with me. What comes next didn't come from a lawyer or a document. It came from an 8-year-old who had no idea what she had just told me. Quick note, some details ahead have been shaped for storytelling. If that's not for you, this is a good place to stop. For those staying, I'm glad you're here. 3 days after I photographed that screen, Gracie called me at home. It was a weeknight past 8 o'clock. I was at the kitchen table in Calverton, reading through a set of contractor specifications I had agreed to review for a former colleague. The kind of work I still took on occasionally to keep my mind moving. The phone was on the table beside me, and when I saw Gracie's name on the screen, I picked up immediately. Her voice was quiet, not the quiet of a child who is tired and winding down for the night, the quiet of a child who has positioned herself somewhere she believes she cannot be heard. "Grandpa," she said in a voice just above a whisper. "Hey, sweetheart," I said. "It's late. Everything okay?" "I'm in my room." A pause. In the background, faintly, I could hear what sounded like a television, a low, constant murmur from somewhere else in the house. "I have to tell you something. I've been thinking about it for a while." I set down the specification sheets. "Go ahead," I said. "One time," she said, speaking quickly now, like a child reciting something they have rehearsed but are not entirely sure they have right. "One time I saw Dad put something in your coffee. A little white pill. He put it in when you were outside with Mom. I thought it was like the vitamins Mom takes in the morning. But," she stopped, "I don't think it was a vitamin." I sat with that for a moment. "When was this, sweetheart?" I asked. My voice was steady. I made sure of that. "A few weeks ago," she said. "On a Saturday when you were here. Did you see it happen more than once?" A brief silence. "I think so. Maybe twice. But I'm not sure about the second time." "Okay," I said. "Thank you for telling me. You did exactly the right thing." I paused. "Is everything okay there tonight? Are you safe?" "Yeah," she said. "Dad's watching TV. He doesn't know I'm calling." "Good," I said. Go to sleep. Sweetheart, I love you. Love you too. Grandpa. I sat at the kitchen table after I hung up and did not move for a while. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something colder than anger. The particular stillness that comes when a thing you have been half suspecting becomes a thing you half know, and you understand that you cannot half know it anymore. I thought about the Saturdays, not all of them. The ones from April through August had been ordinary in the way that good mornings are ordinary. But the ones since September, since Brett had moved in with his suitcase and his easy smile and his fresh brewed coffee. I had come home from several of those feeling not tired in the way of a long drive and an outdoor morning, but tired in the specific heavy way that arrives behind the eyes and settles in the joints and does not lift until after dark. I had attributed it to age. I was 68, and 68 has its own vocabulary of fatigue, and it had been convenient even to let that vocabulary absorb what I was feeling without asking whether something else was writing the words. I had blamed my age for something that had another explanation entirely. Diphenhydramine. The active ingredient in most over-the-counter sleep aids is not detectable by taste in coffee. It dissolves cleanly. At double the standard dose, it produces pronounced drowsiness, cognitive slowing, and disorientation in older adults. It is the kind of medication that a person of 68, taking it unknowingly, might readily attribute to fatigue, to stress, to the ordinary accumulations of age. It would not make them unconscious. It would make them seem to anyone watching, to anyone waiting, like someone who was becoming less reliable, less sharp, less capable of managing their own affairs, less capable of evaluating a document before they signed it. I sat there in my kitchen in Calverton and understood with the cold precision that replaced emotion when the stakes were high enough, what the coffee had been for. A power of attorney requires a competent signature. A man who appeared to be declining, who arrived to family gatherings tired and confused, who forgot details, who needed help, was a man whose family might reasonably begin making arrangements on his behalf, arrangements that could include signing documents. It was not a complicated plan. It did not need to be. Simple plans executed consistently over enough time tend to work. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the table and read the specification sheets without retaining a word of them. And sometime around midnight, I made myself a cup of tea and thought about what I had to do next. The next morning, I drove to Harlow Beach earlier than usual. Brett was in the kitchen when I came through the door. Nora was getting Gracie ready for school upstairs. I could hear them moving around overhead, the particular rhythm of a school morning. Brett had coffee made. He poured a mug and set it on the counter in front of me in the same easy way he always did. And he said something about the weather turning cold, and I said, "Yes, it had." I wrapped both hands around the mug. I let the warmth come through to my palms. Then I set it down. "Doctor said I should cut back," I told him. Brett nodded. He did not press. He refilled his own cup and took it with him toward the living room, citing something on his phone, and was gone from the kitchen within 2 minutes. I waited until I heard the living room door pull mostly shut. Then I moved to the cabinet above the coffee maker, the one I had built into the design myself, positioned at Nora's eye level for ease, and I took out the canister Brett kept there. Dark roast, the same brand that had been in the house since September. I had already sent one sample to the lab. This was the second, a reserve dated and sealed, kept in case the first was challenged or lost. I opened the Ziploc bag I had brought in my jacket pocket, transferred a portion of the grounds into it, sealed it, and wrote the date on the outside. I put the canister back exactly as I had found it. I had a sealed jar of coffee and a granddaughter who had told the truth because she didn't know it was a truth worth telling. Now, I needed someone I could trust. The following afternoon, I drove to Harlow Beach, not to Nora's house. I parked in front of Audrey's. I had passed her driveway dozens of times over the past 7 months without giving it particular thought. A narrow gravel drive leading up to a white clapboard house. The same modest scale as the others on this stretch of road, with a covered porch facing the water and a small garden along the south wall that she tended herself despite having mentioned once that her knees had not been the same since she turned 60. The lights were on in the front room. I sat in the truck for a moment, then got out. She answered the door before I knocked. She had seen me pull up. "Warren," she said. She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in." Audrey's front room was the room of a person who had spent a long professional life working with language and evidence. 2 walls were shelved floor-to-ceiling legal texts, annotated volumes, a row of case reporters in faded green cloth bindings that I suspected she had carried from her courthouse office when she retired, a reading chair angled toward the window, a side table with a legal pad, and a mechanical pencil. The afternoon light came through the west-facing glass at a low angle and lay across the floorboards in long, flat strips. She gestured toward the chair across from hers and poured 2 cups of tea from the pot she apparently already had waiting, which told me she had been expecting something like this for longer than yesterday. I sat down. I put the Ziploc bag on the coffee table between us without explaining it yet. Then, I told her everything. I had rehearsed none of it. That was intentional, I had found over the years. That rehearsed accounts of difficult things tended to smooth over the parts that needed to stay rough to make the shape of a thing cleaner than it actually was. I wanted her to hear it the way it was. I told her about the loan in 2019, the 5 years of silence that followed. I told her about the man with the clipboard in September and the plate number she had already given me, and what I had found when I ran it against Raymond Holt's broker record. I told her about Brett on the beach with his LLC proposal and his rehearsed figures and his voice that had been just slightly too fast. I told her about the laptop screen in the dark kitchen, the past due envelope in the coat pocket, the November 1st deadline. And then I told her about Gracie's phone call. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind off the water moved through the grass along the south wall of the house. Audrey reached to the side table and picked up the legal pad. She turned it so I could see. 14 entries. Dates going back to the first week of September, written in the precise, compressed hand of someone who had spent decades taking notes in proceedings where every word mattered. September 4th, gray sedan, unfamiliar. Parked facing house 740A. Departed, 8:15. September 10th. B. On back porch. Phone call approximately 40 minutes. Voice audible from property line. September 17th. Virginia plate. And she had the same number I had. She had been watching longer than I had. She had simply been waiting until I came to her. I spent 22 years on the circuit court, she said. 14 of those years I handled civil fraud cases, property mostly, deed transfers, forged POAs, manufactured incompetency claims. She set the legal pad down. I know what the early stages look like. I asked her what she meant by manufactured incompetency. Someone who needs a POA has to establish that the grantor is willing and capable, she said. Or, alternatively, that they are no longer capable and require assistance. If Brett intended to obtain a POA from Nora, that would allow him to refinance the property, and your timeline suggests that's exactly what the November 1st deadline is for. Then a grantor who appeared to be declining would make the process easier, less scrutiny, less pushback. She looked at the bag on the table. I know a private laboratory, she said. I've used them before in a professional capacity. They're reliable, they're discreet, and they can turn around a substance analysis in 72 hours. She picked up the bag and examined it briefly. And I have a former colleague, a civil attorney in Chesapeake, whom I trust completely. I'd like to call him tonight. I nodded. There was something I wanted to say and was not sure how to say, which was not a feeling I was accustomed to. I had spent 40 years saying precisely what a situation required in the clearest possible terms. I said, "She doesn't know any of this." "Nora, I know," Audrey said. "I need her not to know until I have something I can actually show her. Not suspicion, not a feeling. Something with a date on it and a signature at the bottom." Audrey was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's not why you came to me instead of her. It wasn't a question. I thought about it anyway." "No," I said. "It isn't." She did not ask me to explain further. One of the things I had come to appreciate about Audrey was that she understood the difference between a thing that needed explaining and a thing that simply needed to be acknowledged. Before I stood to leave, she said, "Warren, you didn't come to me because you were afraid. You came because you were ready." I put my jacket on. I thanked her for the tea, which I had not touched. She walked me to the door, and we stood for a moment on her porch, looking out at the water. The same water visible from Nora's house, 3 houses down, where the lights were on in the kitchen, and a man I had known for 12 years was making plans I was no longer going to pretend I did not see. I drove home without stopping at Nora's. We sent the coffee to the lab on Tuesday. The results came back on Friday. Audrey called me at 7 o'clock in the morning at my house. I was in my kitchen making breakfast when Audrey called. Not the elaborate kind of breakfast. 2 eggs, toast, the same coffee I had been making myself at home since September, with particular attention to the fact that I had made it myself. Outside, the light was the thin gray of early November, the kind that arrives without warmth and stays that way until noon. I had been awake since 5:30, which had become something of a habit in the past 2 weeks. Some mornings the waiting is louder than sleep. I picked up on the first ring. The report came back. Audrey said, she did not say good morning. That told me something before she said anything else. "Go ahead," I said. "Diphenhydramine." She read from the report with the same measured precision she brought to everything. Detected at approximately twice the standard recommended dosage. The lab noted that concentration levels in the sample were consistent with deliberate addition rather than incidental contamination. I set my fork down. "Twice." I said. "Twice the recommended dosage," she said. At that concentration in a person of your age and body weight, the effects would include significant drowsiness, slowed cognitive processing, and in some cases, mild disorientation, onset within 30 to 45 minutes of consumption, duration of 4 to 6 hours. I looked at my coffee cup on the table, my own coffee, in my own kitchen, that I had made myself. I thought about the Saturdays driving home when the road had felt longer than it was, the afternoons I had written off as age, the evenings I had arrived back in Calverton and sat down in the living room chair and not gotten up again until dark. He had been doing it for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. A 68-year-old man living alone falling asleep at odd hours. It would look like the ordinary arithmetic of getting older. To a doctor who did not know to ask, it would look like fatigue. To a family member proposing that perhaps someone needed help managing their affairs, it would look like the beginning of a reason. A power of attorney does not require the grantor to be incapacitated. It requires only that the grantor appear to need assistance and that there is someone willing to provide it. Brett had been building that appearance one Saturday morning at a time. "Warren," Audrey said. Her voice had shifted slightly. The tone she used when she was about to say something she had considered carefully before saying. The report is signed and dated. The methodology is documented. I've already sent a copy to Martin. Martin Ellery, the civil attorney in Chesapeake. I had spoken to him once briefly the afternoon I had gone to Audrey's house, a careful, unhurried voice on the phone that had asked the right questions and not asked the unnecessary ones. What did he say? I asked. He said the report, combined with the documentation, you already have the email, the plate trace, the financial records, constitutes a substantial evidentiary foundation, sufficient for criminal referral and for a civil action to protect the property. I was quiet for a moment. He wants to know if you're ready to file, she said. Not yet, I said. There was a pause, not a surprised one. Audrey had been expecting this, or something like it. I need to talk to Nora first, I said. She deserves to hear this from me, not from a police report, not from a court filing she finds out about afterward. I paused. Martin can hold the file for 48 hours. He already offered, Audrey said. He thought you might ask. I thanked her. I told her I would call her after I spoke to Nora. She said she would be home, and we hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after that without eating. The eggs had gone cold. Outside, the November light had settled into its flat, permanent gray. An hour later, I got in my truck and drove to Harlow Beach. I did not go inside. I parked on the street, not in the driveway, not in my usual spot, and I sat with the engine off and looked at the house I had built, the single-story line of it against the sky, the wide porch I had designed for 2 chairs, the large windows, and behind them, in the kitchen and the adjoining dining area, the shapes of 2 people at the table. Brett was seated at the far end. He had his phone in front of him and a cup of something coffee, likely at his right hand. He was not looking up. Gracie was at the near end of the table, her back partially to the window. She was drawing. I could see the particular way she hunched over a piece of paper when she was concentrating. Shoulders slightly forward, one foot hooked around the chair leg. She had been drawing that way since she was 5 years old and had claimed the corner of my drafting table in Calverton as her personal workspace whenever I watched her for the afternoon. I sat there for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard. Then I started the truck and pulled away from the curb. The hardest thing I had done in a long time was sit in that driveway and not walk through that front door. Not because I was afraid of what I would find inside, but because Gracie was at that table drawing in the particular way she drew, and the conversation I needed to have was not one that should happen anywhere near her. I drove back to Calverton and went to my office and sat at the desk with the legal pad in front of me. I had one more thing to do before I could face Brett. I had to talk to my daughter first. I had texted Nora from my house the night before. Can you meet me at the beach tomorrow morning early, before Brett wakes up? She replied 3 minutes later. I'll be there. Not what's wrong. Not is everything okay. Not can we just talk on the phone. 3 minutes and 4 words. And that was the end of the exchange. I had raised a practical woman, and in that moment I was more grateful for that fact than I had words for. I drove to Harlow Beach before the sun was up. I parked at the small public lot 2 blocks north of the house and walked down to the water and stood there in the dark and the cold waiting. The beach at that hour in mid-November had the particular emptiness of a place that has not yet decided to be a place. No color to the water, no clear line between the sand and the sky, just gradations of gray that shifted slowly as the light began to come. She appeared at the top of the dune path in her dark jacket and the flat-soled boots she wore when her left knee was stiff from the cold. She picked her way down to the sand with the slight adjustment in her gait that I had noticed since her bike accident 6 years ago, and that she had stopped noticing herself. She did not look surprised to see me standing there. She looked like a woman who had been awake for several hours already. She came and stood beside me at the waterline, and we both looked at the water for a moment without speaking. "How bad is it?" she said. "I need you to hear all of it before you respond," I said. She turned slightly toward me. "Okay." "So," I told her. I had told it to Audrey 2 weeks before in a front room full of legal texts, and it had come out in pieces then assembled as I went. The way you assemble evidence when you are still not entirely certain of its full shape. This time, I knew the shape. I told it in order from the beginning, without acceleration, and without editorializing the loan from 2019 never repaid. The suitcase in September and Brett's question about the house's value on the porch that same afternoon. The man with the clipboard on the Wednesday in mid-September. Light blue polo, methodical, gone before I could reach him. Raymond Holt. His broker license. His 3 years alongside Brett at Coastal Premium Properties. The beach conversation about the LLC and what an LLC with Brett as managing member would have actually meant. The laptop screen in the dark kitchen. The past due envelope in the coat pocket. November 1st. And then Gracie's phone call. Nora had been watching the water while I talked, the way she listened to things that required her full attention, still facing forward, not interrupting. When I said Gracie's name in that context, she turned her head toward me, not quickly, carefully. "She saw him do it," she said. "She thought it was a vitamin," I said. "She called me from her bedroom after 8 o'clock because she'd been thinking about it and wasn't sure if it mattered. She didn't know it was the kind of thing worth reporting." I paused. "She told me because she trusted me, not because she understood what she'd seen." Nora looked back at the water. She was quiet long enough that I could hear the waves coming in small waves in November, without much force, just the steady arrival of water that had come a long way to reach the sand. "There has to be an explanation," she said. Her voice was careful, not defensive, not dismissive, but the voice of someone genuinely trying to apply fairness to a conclusion they are not ready to reach. For some of it. He told me the market had been difficult. The financial pressure was real. I knew that much. The LLC. Maybe he really was just trying. I reached into my jacket pocket. I had folded the 3 documents together the night before and placed them in the interior pocket of my jacket, the one with the button, because I had wanted them where I could reach them without looking. I took them out now and held them toward her without speaking. She took them. She read the way she had always read, with her full attention, starting at the top of the first page and working to the bottom before moving on. Not skimming, not stopping in the middle to react. I had watched her read that way since she was 8 years old and had found my engineering specifications on the coffee table and worked through a full page before asking me what compressive load meant. I looked at the water while she read. The light was coming up now, the gray beginning to differentiate itself, the water becoming a shade darker than the sky, the horizon line sharpening into something definite. When she finished, she sat down on the sand. Not a collapse, not a dramatic descent. She simply sat. The way a person sits when they realize that standing is requiring more effort than the situation warrants. I sat down beside her. For a while, neither of us said anything. The light continued to come in. A pair of sanderlings moved along the waterline 30 yards to our left, working the foam with the busy indifference of birds who have no interest in the concerns of the people nearby. There were signs, Nora said. She was looking at the pages in her hand, but I did not think she was reading them anymore. Her voice had a particular quality, not broken, but altered. The sound of a person reconfiguring something they had believed to be fixed. He kept asking about the joint accounts, how much was in them, whether I had access to move money if I needed to. I thought he was worried about liquidity, that it was the stress talking. She stopped. He came home late twice last week, and both times he said it was a client meeting, and I didn't ask which client because I didn't want to seem like I was checking up on him. She set the pages down on her knee. I didn't question it, she said, because I didn't have a reason to question it, and I didn't look for a reason because I didn't want to find one. That's not a character failing, I said. That's what happens when the evidence runs against what you want to be true. The mind finds the most livable explanation and stops there. She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was quieter than the one she had been using, not a whisper, but something with less weight behind it, like a sentence said to herself as much as to me. Mom would have known. I looked at her. She always saw through people. Nora said, not with suspicion. She wasn't suspicious by nature, but she paid attention to the things other people let pass. Small inconsistencies, the way a person's behavior didn't quite line up with what they were saying. She paused. She would have seen something in him a long time ago, and she wouldn't have let it go quiet. I thought about June, not with the full weight that her name usually carried, but with the brief, clean clarity that sometimes came instead. A window opened, a moment of air, and then closed again. I saw things, too. I said, I just didn't want to call them by their right name. She looked at me. How long? Suspicion, not certainty. Since September, I said, when he asked about the house price. When Audrey asked me how well I knew him, and I said enough, and afterward I sat in my truck and wasn't sure I'd been telling the truth. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at the pages again. I want to keep these, she said. They're yours, I said. She folded them and put them in her jacket pocket. Then she looked out at the water one more time, the way you look at something when you were about to leave it, taking a last accounting. We got up from the sand together and walked back to the house along the waterline, close enough that our footsteps came out side by side in the wet sand behind us. She didn't say much, and neither did I. At the base of the dune stairs, she stopped for a moment, looking north along the beach at nothing in particular. I waited. Then she went up. Brett was in the kitchen when we came through the door, standing at the counter, with a fresh cup of coffee in the shirt he wore when he was working from home. He looked up when he heard us come in and smiled the same easy, unhurried smile that I had known for 12 years, the one that arrived quickly and settled into place as if it had always been there. Morning, he said. You're both up early. He poured 2 cups and set them on the counter without being asked the way he had been doing since September. That was the last morning he smiled in this house. Before I tell you what happened next morning, comment door below, because a door is about to close in this story and nothing goes back after that. Note: what follows includes some reconstructed detail. The weight of it, though, is not fiction. We had arranged it the night before, Nora and I, over text, she inside the house, and I sitting in my truck at the far end of Harlow Road, that we would do this together in the morning when Gracie was at Audrey's. I had parked down the street because I did not want Brett to see my truck in the driveway and adjust whatever he was doing before I came through the door. It was the kind of calculation I had not had to make in my life before the past 2 months, and I was aware of that, of how differently I was thinking now compared to 8 months ago, when I had pulled into this same driveway on a warm April Saturday and watched a small girl run toward me across the grass. That man had not known what kind of thinking would eventually be required of him. Audrey had taken Gracie by 7:30 without a word of explanation asked or given. I had called her the previous evening and said only that we would need Gracie out of the house for the morning. She had said, "I'll pick her up at 7:15. She can help me with the garden." We had not discussed it further. I came through the front door at 8 o'clock. Nora was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee she was not drinking. She had dressed carefully, not for any formal reason, but in the way a person dresses when they want to feel like themselves, like someone who has made a decision and is standing inside it. She looked at me when I came in, and I gave her a single nod, and she gave one back. Brett was in the living room, in the chair by the window. He had his phone face down on the arm of the chair and a cup of coffee on the side table, in the particular posture of a man who is pretending to be relaxed. He had not yet understood the quality of the morning was different, or perhaps he had begun to suspect it and had not yet decided how to respond. "Warren," he said, with the easy smile. "Why, you're up early." "I need a few minutes," I said. "With both of you at the table." The smile stayed in place, but it lost something, the effortlessness of it, the automatic quality. He stood and followed us to the dining table, and I took my jacket off and laid it over the back of a chair, and I placed the 4 documents on the table in a row. The lab report first, the signed, dated analysis from the private laboratory with its methodology section and its conclusion. Diphenhydramine detected at approximately twice the standard recommended dosage concentration, consistent with deliberate addition. Next to it, the printed email. Refinance application. 14 Harlow Beach Road. $280,000 with the power of attorney language in the body, and the October 31st deadline visible in the second paragraph. Then, the single page containing Raymond Holt's name, his Virginia broker license number, and the documented overlap with Brett at Coastal Premier Properties between 2014 and 2017. Last, the LLC authorization document, the one Brett had handed me 3 weeks earlier with a pen already uncapped, returned now unsigned, placed at the far end of the row. I set them down the way I had always set out drawings before a project review in sequence, with space between them so that everything could be seen at once and nothing could be missed. Brett looked at each one. I watched his face move through the stages of that. The first quick scan of recognition, the second slower read of assessment, the internal calculation running behind the eyes. The smile had not gone entirely. It had become something else, the expression of a man deciding in real time how much he could still recover. "Warren," he said. He spread his hands slightly, a gesture I had seen him use before in conversations he wanted to redirect, a kind of open palmed that suggested reasonableness without committing to anything specific. "I think you're misreading what you're looking at." I said nothing. I had found in 40 years of working through problems that silence was frequently more useful than a response. "The refinance inquiry was research," he said. "Holt and I go back years. I asked him to pull market comparables for the area that's a normal professional conversation. The subject line on that email looks more formal than it was." He touched the edge of the email printout without picking it up. "As for the LLC, that was a tax strategy, a standard protective structure. I should have explained it better. I'll grant you that." "The lab report," I said. He stopped. "Diphenhydramine," I said. "At twice the recommended dose in coffee taken from this kitchen." I looked at him steadily. "I'm 68 years old, and I've been driving home from this house on Saturdays feeling like I was 20 years older than I am. I've been attributing it to my age." I paused. I know now that was an error in attribution. Something changed in his face. Not guilt. At least not the kind that looks like remorse. The kind that looks like a person recalculating what is still possible. He turned to Nora. "Nora," he said. His voice had shifted registers lower, the tone he used when he wanted to be believed. "Come on. You know me. Whatever conclusions your father has drawn from, don't." Nora said. One word. No raised voice. No trembling. Just the flat, settled weight of someone who has already finished the conversation Brett was trying to start. He looked at her for a moment. She did not look away. I continued. "I want to be clear about what this conversation is." I said, "An attorney in Chesapeake has held this file for 36 hours. The lab report, the email, the financial records showing the outstanding debt, and the refinance application prepared without authorization. The plate trace connecting Raymond Holt to this address in September." I let that sit for a moment. This is not a conversation about whether these things happened. That question has already been answered. This is a conversation about what happens next. Brett set his coffee cup down on the table. He did not speak for a moment. The ease that had been part of his physical presence since September, the settled, proprietary comfort of a man who believed he had control of the situation, had gone out of him. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The way heat leaves a room when a window is opened steadily, without announcement, until the difference is undeniable. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at me. He looked once at Nora and then away because she was still not looking away from him. And that particular steadiness was, I think, the thing he had not prepared for. He had prepared for Warren. He had not fully prepared for Nora. "You have no idea," he said finally, "what I've been managing. The debt. The market. The position I was in." His voice had changed again. Not the calculating register now. Not the reasonable appeal. Something more unguarded. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was trying to solve a problem. "With my daughter's house," I said. He had no answer to that. The sentence did not require one. He stood up from the table. He went to the entryway and put on his jacket. He picked up his phone from the counter and put it in his pocket. He did not go upstairs. He did not take the navy suitcase that had been standing in the corner of the entryway since the first Saturday of September, which was either an oversight or in some way I could not fully interpret an acknowledgement. He moved to the door, and his hand was on the handle, and then he paused. He did not turn around. "This isn't over." "Warren," he said. I looked at him from across the room, across the width of the house I had designed, the pine floors I had specified and sourced and watched go down board by board over 3 weeks in the winter of 2023. The windows I had positioned to catch the light exactly as it was catching it now, low and clean through the glass, falling across the table, and the documents, and the two of us who remained. "You're right," I said. "It isn't. But your part in it is." He opened the door and walked out. It closed behind him, not slammed, not eased shut with excessive care, simply closed, the way a door closes when the person leaving it has run out of things to perform. Nora did not move for a long time. She sat at the table with both hands flat on the surface, looking at the space where Brett had been standing. I sat across from her. Neither of us said anything. Outside, through the windows that faced the water, the ocean moved the way it always moved, indifferent, unhurried, entirely unaffected by what had just happened in the house behind it. The door had closed behind him. Nora didn't move for a long time. Neither did I. We just sat there in the house I had built, listening to the sound of the ocean. For the first time since the house was finished. I didn't drive home that night. I stayed. There was no formal decision about it. After Brett walked out and the door closed, Nora and I sat at the table for a long time without speaking. And when Gracie came back from Audrey's around noon, She walked in, the way children walk into a room that has changed while they were gone, cautiously, reading the air before committing to her usual speed. She looked at the table, at the two of us, at the absence where Brett's coffee cup had been, and she did not ask where he was. She came and sat beside me and put her hand on the table next to mine, not quite touching the way children do when they want contact without making a claim on it. I stayed. I slept in the room Nora had set up for guests, the one with the east-facing window where the light came in early in a way that was different from my house in Calverton, warmer and more salt-weighted, carrying the sound of the water. I had designed that window myself 3 years ago at my drafting table, angling it to catch the morning light. I had not anticipated sleeping in the room behind it. The days that followed had a specific quality I had not anticipated. Not grief exactly, and not relief, but something that combined elements of both without being cleanly either one. Nora went to work on the second day because she is a teacher, and her students were there whether or not her life had rearranged itself. And she came home in the afternoon with the particular exhaustion of someone who has held a professional face in place for 8 hours. Gracie went to school. I drove her both days, and she sat in the passenger seat of my truck and talked about things that were not the situation, which I understood was how she was managing it. On the third evening, after Gracie was in bed, Nora and I sat on the front porch with tea and looked at the water. "I should have seen it," she said. "You saw what he wanted you to see." I said, "That isn't the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. I knew something was off. I told myself it was the market pressure, that he was just closed off because of stress. She held her cup in both hands the way Audrey did when she was thinking. I kept explaining it away because explaining it away was easier than the alternative. "That's what people do," I said. "It's not a failure of intelligence. It's what happens when the evidence conflicts with what you want to be true." She looked at me for a moment in the specific way she had looked at me since she was a child, the look that meant she was accepting something, not just hearing it. Audrey came by on the 4th morning. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Nora's pot, the left one, and she told us what Martin Ellery had set in motion. The criminal referral had been filed with the Commonwealth's attorney for the county. The evidence package, lab report, email, documentation, plate trace, financial records had been formally submitted. Brett and Raymond Holt were now subjects of an active investigation. "What does that mean for him specifically?" Nora asked. "It means law enforcement is reviewing the evidence." Audrey said, "In Virginia, administering a controlled or potentially harmful substance to another person without their consent is a felony. The fraud-related charges, the refinance application prepared without authorization, the power of attorney solicited under false pretenses carry their own weight. Martin expects formal charges within a few weeks." "Travel restrictions?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. "That comes with arraignment if the court imposes them. Until formal charges are filed, he can move freely. But Martin has notified his counsel." She looked at me over the rim of her cup. "Brett retained an attorney yesterday afternoon," she said, "which is what a person does when they know what's coming." I nodded. Audrey left after an hour, and Nora went to make lunch. And I sat for a moment at the kitchen table alone in the house I had built. I looked at the pine floors I had specified, the wide doorways I had designed for Nora's knee, the windows facing the water, the brass hook by the door where I had hung my jacket every Saturday morning for 8 months. I thought about June, not with the weight I usually carried it, but lightly, a hand on the shoulder for a moment, and then gone. On the 5th day, I drove home. Not because there was a reason to leave, and not because the situation had resolved itself, but because Nora had a life to rebuild that she needed to begin rebuilding on her own terms, and because Gracie needed to see that the ordinary shape of things could come back. Her mother in the kitchen, her grandfather visiting on weekends, the sound of the water outside doing what it always did. I was not the variable that needed to be permanent. I was the one that needed to stay consistent. I pulled into my carport in Calverton just before noon and stood in the kitchen of my own house, the modest two-bedroom with the yellow door that Gracie had never fully understood. It was quiet in the way it had always been quiet, but it felt less like absence than it used to. I could not have said precisely why. On the kitchen counter where I had placed it months ago was the first drawing Gracie had given me. The 3 crayon figures at the water's edge with the word June in the upper corner. I had kept it there since September, slightly curled at one edge from the humidity. Beside it now, I set the new one, the one Audrey had handed me as I was leaving that morning, saying Gracie had asked her to pass it along. A house, not my house in Calverton, but the beach house. The wide single-story line of it, the big windows, the porch, in front of it, the water, above it, a sky with clouds that had faces drawn in them in the particular way Gracie drew faces, 2 dots and a line, no people on the beach, no figures missing, just the house and the water and the sky, complete in itself. No Brett, no gap where he had been, nothing absent. I stood there and looked at both drawings for a while. The legal part of this story didn't wait for the emotions to settle, and Audrey's attorney had already begun moving. December at Harlow Beach was cold and gray, and the law moved slowly even when everything else wanted to run. That month, I drove the 25 minutes between Calverton and the coast more times than I could count. The first meeting with Martin Ellery was on a Tuesday morning in early December in his office in Chesapeake, a 4th-floor suite in a building that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee, the particular combination of smells that serious work accumulates over time. He was a compact man in his late 50s with reading glasses he kept taking on and off, and he had the quality of a person who had spent decades in courtrooms learning that the most useful thing he could do was not fill silence unnecessarily. I liked him immediately. He walked us through what he had submitted and what he expected to follow. Martin had submitted the full evidence package to the Commonwealth's attorney for the county, the lab report, the email documentation, the financial records, the broker license cross-reference establishing the connection between Brett and Raymond Holt. The Commonwealth's attorney had accepted the referral and was preparing formal charges on 2 primary counts. The first was administering a harmful substance without consent, a felony under Virginia law carrying a sentence of up to 5 years. The second was forgery and uttering related to the fraudulent preparation of power of attorney documents for property purposes, a Class 5 felony carrying up to 10 years. Raymond Holt faced conspiracy charges as a co-defendant. Arraignment was expected within 3 to 4 weeks. At that point, the court would consider travel restrictions. He retained counsel the day after the confrontation. Martin said, "His attorney has been in contact with my office. They're aware of the evidentiary position. I asked what that meant practically. It means they know what we have," he said. People make different decisions when they know what the evidence looks like. Nora sat beside me through most of that meeting without speaking, which was her way of absorbing information. She had been that way since grade school. The child who listened completely before asking the single most useful question. When Martin finished, she asked, "How long does all of this take?" Criminal proceedings in Virginia at this scale typically resolve within 6 to 12 months of formal charges, he said. It may be less, depending on how his counsel advises him to proceed. She nodded once. Then she asked another question, not to Martin, but to me quietly as we were putting on our coats to leave. "Lexi, will you come with me to one more office?" The second office was 3 blocks away, a family law attorney, a referral from Martin, a woman named Carol Devers, who had handled divorce proceedings in the county for 20 years, and who spoke to Nora with the particular directness of someone who had learned to give people information without softening it into uselessness. I sat in the waiting room while Nora was inside. I read a magazine I did not retain a word of, and looked out the window at the gray December street, and thought about nothing specific. Nora came out 40 minutes later. She had the particular look of a person who has just signed something significant, not relieved, not distressed, settled, the look of a decision made and committed to. She did not tell me what she had signed, and I did not ask. It was her marriage and her choice, and my role that morning had been to drive her there and wait. We had lunch at a diner 2 blocks from the office, coffee sandwiches, a window table looking out at the street. We talked mostly about Gracie's upcoming school performance, which she had been rehearsing for since October, and which she had described to me in extensive detail on the drive down. The normalcy of it was deliberate, I think, on both our parts. Some conversations you have by not having them. In January, I met with Martin again, alone this time, on a Saturday morning before I drove down to Harlow Beach. The purpose of that meeting was the trust. A revocable living trust is a legal structure in which a grantor, in this case, me, transfers property into a trust that names specific beneficiaries and sets conditions on how the property can be managed or transferred. It does not change who benefits from the property. It changes the mechanism of protection around it. A deed, as I had learned, establishes ownership, but does not insulate a property from the legal maneuvers of a spouse, a POA holder, or a creditor with the right documentation. A trust creates a shell that those maneuvers cannot easily penetrate. I should have done it when I finished the house. I knew the mechanics of it. I had structured contracts and specifications for 40 years. I understood the difference between a document that conferred rights and a document that protected them. I had chosen not to because I had trusted the situation, which was a different thing from trusting the structure, and I had confused the two. I did not make that mistake a second time. The trust named Nora as primary beneficiary and Gracie as secondary. No transaction affecting the property, no refinancing, no transfer. No encumbrance could proceed without the written consent of the trustee, which was me for the duration of my lifetime, and thereafter a successor trustee named in the document. Martin walked me through the signing with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, and when it was done, I held the copy of the executed trust in my hands for a moment before folding it into my jacket pocket. $390,000 of pine and glass and wide doorways wrapped now in something that would hold. That evening, I called Eugene and Miriam at the care facility in Roanoke. My father answered on the second ring. He was 91 years old, and his hearing had not been reliable for a decade, but his voice was the same voice it had always been, deliberate, unhurried. The voice of a man who had never found a reason to be louder than the situation required. I told him the summary. Not every detail, but the shape of it. What Brett had done. What I had done about it. Where things stood now. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "You did the right thing, son." That was all. My mother took the phone and asked whether Gracie was eating properly and sleeping in her own room, and I told her yes to both, and we talked for a few minutes about nothing consequential, and then I said goodnight and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table in Calverton and looked at the 2 drawings on the counter, the old one with the 3 crayon figures and the word June, and the new one with the beach house and the water, and the clouds with faces, and the copy of the trust folded beside them. You did the right thing, son. 8 words from a 91-year-old man in a care facility in Roanoke, delivered without drama over a phone line. I had not known until that moment how much I had needed to hear them. By February, the legal proceedings were nearly complete. Brett's name had disappeared from everything that mattered. What remained was figuring out how to move forward, and the 25 minutes between my house and theirs had never felt shorter. When March came, the worst of it was behind us. I drove to Harlow Beach on a Saturday morning, the same as always, except that this time Gracie was standing at the end of the driveway waiting, not at the door, not on the porch, at the end of the driveway in her boots and her jacket arms at her sides, watching the road the way she used to watch it when she was smaller. And the truck was the best thing that was going to happen all day. She had grown an inch since September, maybe more. I noticed it the way you notice things that happen slowly, all at once after the fact. She did not wait for me to park properly. She came to the truck while it was still rolling to a stop, opened the passenger door before I had cut the engine, and said, "Grandpa, come look at the sun." I came. We went through the side gate and down to the beach, Gracie leading, picking her way through the dune grass with the particular confidence of a child who has claimed a piece of landscape as her own. Nora was already there, standing at the edge of the firm sand where the tide had compacted it overnight. She was wearing the dark jacket from November, her hands in her pockets, looking at the water the way you look at something that has been there for a long time and will be there when you are gone. She did not turn when she heard us come up behind her. She just moved sideways, making room, and the 3 of us stood at the waterline together. The sun was low, and the water was that particular color it gets in early spring. Not the flat pewter of October or the bright green of July, but something in between, a color that has not quite decided what it is. The beach was empty in both directions. The air had the cold in it still, but not the bone-deep cold of winter, more like a door left open. Gracie bent down and began collecting shells moving along the waterline with her eyes on the sand focused with the totality of attention the children bring to small things. I watched her for a while. She had June's way of moving when she was looking for something, that particular unhurried efficiency, as if time was simply not a consideration when something interesting was close enough to find. After a while, Nora spoke. "Dad," she said. Not a formal address. Not Warren's daughter asking Warren a careful question. Just Dad. The flat plain word that means the question is going to be honest. "Why did you really build this house?" I looked out at the water. I had given the answer in pieces over months, in ways that were all true but also incomplete. The knee, the stairs, the windows for the light, June's wish. All of those things were accurate. None of them were the whole answer. "Because June asked me to take care of you," I said, "and I didn't know any other way to do it." Nora was quiet beside me for a moment. Then she reached over and took my hand at the way a child takes a hand, but the way an adult does when the words are insufficient and the gesture is the more honest language. We stood like that for a while without speaking. Gracie had moved 20 yards down the beach. She was holding something up to the light, a shell or a piece of sea glass, something small that warranted examination. Then she turned and ran back toward us in the particular way she ran when she was happy and didn't need a reason. Arms slightly out, boots hitting the wet sand with a sound like small punctuation marks. For a moment, in the angle of the light and the way she moved, she looked so much like June that I felt it in the chest. A sharp, clean ache that arrived and then was gone. The way a sound is gone after it finishes. Not grief, not anymore. Something else. Recognition, maybe. The specific comfort of seeing a face you love, continue in a face you love. Then she reached us and threw herself against my side and said breathlessly that she had found a whelk shell with both ends still intact, which was apparently rare, and could she put it on the kitchen windowsill? And Nora said yes before I could respond. We stayed on the beach until the sun was fully up and the cold was something to walk through rather than stand in. On the way back to the house, we passed Audrey's porch. She was there in her usual chair with her usual cup, and she raised a hand when she saw us. I raised mine back. That was sufficient. In the kitchen, Nora made breakfast, and Gracie set the table without being asked, which she did approximately once every 3 weeks, and which Nora and I both pretended was entirely normal so as not to disrupt the pattern. I sat at the end of the table and drank coffee, Nora's coffee, the pot on the left, and I looked at the house I had built from the inside, the pine floors, the wide doorways, the window above the sink that caught the morning light and held it. I left in the early afternoon. Nora walked me out to the truck. She said she was thinking of calling the school about a different committee, something that would take her out of the classroom one afternoon a week and into something new. And I said that sounded right. We talked for a minute about Gracie's whelk shell, which had already been placed on the kitchen windowsill in the position of maximum visibility. Then I got in the truck and she went back inside, and I watched the door close in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the driveway. The drive north on Route 17 took 25 minutes, the same as always. I had the window down slightly, and the air coming in still carried salt from the coast, thinner than at the beach. But there, a trace of it. I came home to the yellow door and the quiet kitchen and the 2 drawings on the counter. I put the kettle on and then didn't make tea. Just stood there looking at the drawings while the kettle came to temperature. The old one with the 3 crayon figures and the word June, and the newer one with the beach house and the faces in the clouds. I sat down at the table, and I understood, sitting there with the salt air still faint in the room, that this was the morning I had been thinking of when I started telling you this story. The porch at sunrise, the photograph of June on the side table, the house I had built for someone else. This is where the story ends. I had said then, but to understand why I'm sitting here this morning, you have to let me take you back to the beginning. Now you have been there. Now you are back. I built that house to keep a promise. It turns out the house kept something for me, too, even from 25 minutes away. I built a house thinking a deed was enough to protect the people I loved. I was wrong. This family story taught me one thing above all. Love without documentation is a prayer. I believe God answers prayers, but He also gave us the wisdom to sign the paperwork. Do not wait until someone is already inside your house to start asking who they really are. I made 2 mistakes. I loaned money without a contract because I wanted to believe in a man. I handed over a house worth nearly $400,000 with nothing but a deed because I confused trust with security. Trust is what you feel. Security is what you build. My advice: do not be like me. Write the contract. Set up the trust. Pay attention to the small things that do not add up, because in my experience, they are never actually small. Every grandpa story is worth telling carries a lesson like this one. This is mine. That is my personal view, and I stand by it. Every family story has a moment where someone should have looked more carefully and did not. I hope this family story saves someone else from the same mistake. This has been one man's grandpa stories, nothing more, nothing less. If it moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you. And if you want more grandpa stories told the way real life feels, subscribe and stay close. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for reflection and understanding. If that is not what you are looking for, this is a good place to step away. No judgment, only respect. For those who stay, I am glad you are here.